All right, Keir and Liam, instead of listening to me babbling on in person, we'll get back to this here. Decolonization in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Going to be a little complicated here as we kind of bounce back and forth between regions. So first of all, what is decolonization? Decolonization is the unraveling, shall we say, of colonialism. And it happens when a country or a nation will separate itself from its former colonial master, like England, France, Spain, Germany, you name it. And they establish and maintain their own territory. So decolonization is a major door hinge of history. And by door hinge, I mean that it happens very quick, very rapid. It closes the door to one period of history and opens the door to a new, unknown future. So decolonization slams the door in the face and ends the old European empire, some of which we talked about last week went back to the Spanish conquistadors in colonization in the 1500s with guys like Cortez and Pizarro. Since this time, Europeans have created enormous empires across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. People in these European colonies wanted, badly thirsted for, and eventually it's going to take time, going to win their freedom. After World War II, we're going to say this several times today, the power structure of the world changes, even more completely than it did after World War I with America rising in strength. Once the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in the Cold War, as we've talked about before, the world will have to divide into two spheres. One, capitalistic, the other, communist. This has an effect, the Cold War, on literally all other nations around the globe. And so as we get to the challenge for democracy, it is the Cold War that will play a large role in the decolonization, as the United States will, in their mind, reinforce the right of people everywhere to create and run their own government as long as it wasn't communist. In turn, the Soviet Union spoke out against Western imperialism. Look at what capitalism did to the world. Look at the way they carved up the globe, and it's created a rich class and a poor class. Both superpowers compete for new allies. This aids the independence movements. People trying to become independent would look for whatever friend they could find. And many of the factors that influence this is good old-fashioned competition. The big problem is that Europe, the continent, is no longer a major superpower. European countries were exhausted. They were battered and bleeding from not one but two world wars in 50 years, and they really just don't want to fight anymore. So this is the time where new nations in Africa and Asia will become known as the developing world. While they were in different parts of the globe, they're going to have three main commonalities. Number one, we've got to develop some sort of our own stable, self-running government. Number two, we've got to find some way to modernize and create a modern economy, very similar to what Peter the Great had tried. And as they modernize infrastructure, communications, number three comes the economy. Around the world, different nations are going to try different paths to accomplish these goals. The transfer of power from Great Britain and France just wasn't all that easy. Europe wanted to go slow and steady, but we're going to start first in Africa, where they want independence now. They want it immediately. The United States and the Soviet Union will offer a wide range of assistance to these nations in order to try and convince them that their type of government and economy was the best. Decolonization is extremely hard, and there are just all kinds of problems, especially in Africa, which was just dissected and chopped up by the Europeans by the Berlin Conference in the 1800s. And the borders that were drawn combined people who had different language and different ethnic ideals. And this was done on purpose by the Europeans to fracture the people to make it easier to control. So the challenge of democracy arises as these new nations are going to write constitutions modeled from the United States, from France, and from Great Britain. Problem is they don't have an infrastructure. Right? They don't have roads and bridges and railroads. They needed to implement a new government, and they simply did not understand. They were like my buddy Bob in the auto factory. They simply didn't understand how much the European powers had really done. Democratic rule was hard to maintain as many of these new nations were not prepared to govern themselves. People want instant gratification, and when they don't get better quickly, there's civil war, there's revolution, or greedy totalitarian leaders who will exploit their own people. They'll become rich, they'll control the government, and the people suffer. So to keep order, it's often a military regime or a dictator that would simply take over. Right? They ban other political parties, and they rally the people around their own version of nationalism, if you remember that from the nationalist unit. However, as long as the country was an ally in the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union would turn a blind eye to the ills of the government in charge as long as they sided with them. So this brings us back to England and France. They were the two largest imperial powers during the age of imperialism, especially on the continent of Africa. Each of them adopted a slow approach designed so the African colonies can eventually attain independence. They'll learn how to do it, they'll be coached through it, and then they'll get it. However, England and France were accustomed to being colonial powers. So as they begin this transfer of power, they discovered that they could not maintain the slow, steady approach they had set down for themselves. Their former colonies just wanted to get moving. When the British and French methods were not quick enough, different protests are going to spring up. This forces the Europeans, who, as I said, were exhausted from the world wars, to fast forward their timetable. And all over Africa, new leaders, many of which were educated in Western universities and organized different political parties in larger cities, they knew how this was done. They began to publish newspapers. They began to enforce the concepts of freedom of speech and democracy. And nationalistic rallies will be held to get the common people to buy into these ideas of independence. And a perfect example of the problems that will occur will be in the West African country of Ghana and the East African country of Kenya. They are great examples of decolonization. West Africa was once home to the great West African kingdoms of Ghana, Songhai, and Mali. And so it's fitting that they become a starting point for African independence. This area has a long history. settled the trans-Saharan trade route carrying gold and salt across Africa to Asia, and the Europeans once named it the Gold Coast because a large exportation of gold came out of this area. It had also become a British colony. Over in East Africa, Kenya was also a British colony. Both Ghana and Kenya achieved independence but took very different routes towards achieving that goal. After World War II, a young citizen of the Gold Coast was named Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame is going to grow frustrated with England's slow but steady approach to independence. Now, as a young student, he had spent time studying in the United States. And he learned about different independence methods. The one that really intrigued him was the independence movement of Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi. So when he returns to Africa, Nkrumah starts to organize an independence movement. Begins this in 1949. He quickly organizes what at the time was seen as a radical political party, and he asked for reforms, concessions from the British government. When Great Britain did not comply, his party organized strikes and boycotts of European goods to get recognition. If you're not going to listen, then we are not going to buy your stuff. We want the concessions we're asking for. Unfortunately, these reforms quickly begin to grow out of control and get out of hand. People begin to riot. There's violence in the Gold Coast. And as a result of this destabilization, Nkrumah is blamed for it, and he's arrested in 1950, where he spends a year in jail. Now, he will eventually get out, and by 1957, the former colony of the Gold Coast wins its independence from Great Britain. Kwame Nkrumah is elected as the Prime Minister of a newly independent nation. He has done it. Now, Nkrumah's first act was to change the name of his new country, and he calls it Ghana, an homage hearkening back to the golden age of West African empires. Now, Nkrumah did this intentionally, as he wanted to remind the people of Africa of their great past. He wanted to throw off the yoke of colonialism. He wanted to encourage African, especially Ghanaian nationalism, and have people take pride in their country. And so Ghana becomes the first country of sub-Saharan Africa to attain its freedom from a former colonial superpower. Unfortunately, in the following years, Nkrumah and his government fall into corruption. The money, the lavishness of the Cold War wooed them, and in 1966, Nkrumah was overthrown in a military coup. It is in 1981 that a young military officer named Jerry Rawlings becomes the leader of Ghana. And he takes measures to stabilize and strengthen Ghana's economy, which from 1966 to 1981 had just depended mostly on the sale of cocoa and gold. Jerry Rawlings is known for bringing democracy back, and under his leadership, political stability returns to this great West African country. In the early 90s, I think it's 92, he wins the first democratic election of Ghana after governing for 10 years. He will step down after he loses an election to a new opponent, saying, "This is how democracy works. I lost. It is now time for me to step away." And so Ghana serves as a role model for decolonization. Over in East Africa, it's a little more different. The country of Kenya and its path to freedom was much, much, much more violent than Ghana. We have a young man named Llamo Kenyatta. And as a young man, Kenyatta was educated in an English mission school in the country of Kenya. By 1946, he has emerged as a Kenyan nationalist leader. He attended college in Great Britain, and when he returns in 1946, he begins to create an organization, or work actually going back to England, in an organization whose primary goal was to return the land of Kenya to the traditional tribesmen known as Kikuyu. Kikuyu, sorry. Gotta take a drink of water here. The Kikuyu were displaced by English settlers hundreds of years earlier. And when Kenyatta returns to Kenya, he wants to lead this movement for independence. Here's the problem. As a new leader in this governmental movement, Kenyatta emphasized the need to peacefully coexist with the white settlers. Now, they had been living in Kenya, and they could say, well, my ancestors came here, but I'm Kenyan. I've lived here. I consider myself an African. Problem is, this peaceful existence simply didn't happen. When the white settlers came to Africa, they created large farms, plantations, if you need to visualize it, on the fertile plains of Kenya. And when they did, they just pushed out the local tribesmen. And the white settlers went further. Remember, this is colonization, and they created laws to not only keep themselves in power, all right, to suppress the natives, but also to maximize their profit. It's old school mercantilism. Kenyatta states that this land belongs to the Kenyans, not the Europeans. Some say, though, after a century in the country, I'm sorry, I'm not European, I'm as Kenyan as you. Doesn't matter if I'm white, I'm Kenyan. Kenyatta says, I'm sorry, we want our land and our power back. Well, when Kenyatta's efforts do not immediately produce the results that he wants, all right, the radical leaders in Kenyatta's movement turn to guerrilla warfare. There we go. I want to make sure you see everything. Radical leaders in Kenyatta's government turn to guerrilla warfare. They raid the farms of the white settlers. They kill the livestock. They begin to raid the farms of white settlers, destroying the crops. And all hopes of forcing the white European settlers to leave is their primary goal. But the guerrilla warfare doesn't work. When that happens, Kenyatta's people begin to openly attack the Africans who were working for the large white settlers' farms. By the 1950s, it didn't matter that some of these were co-ops that the natives helped own. The British sends in official troops to fight the guerrilla threat that they called the Mau Mau. It's the Mau Mau Rebellion. As the visible leader of the independence movement, Kenyatta finds himself arrested in 1952. Even though he wants to curb the violence, he's blamed for it. He and other Kenyans were forced into camps guarded by the British. The Royal Air Force will use bombers to destroy and break up Mau Mau resistance, who had really no access to modern weapons. The Mau Mau are pretty much destroyed by 1956. Shortly after this, Kenyatta was released from prison in 1959, and the freedom movement continues to grow. And his time in prison makes Llamo Kenyatta a national hero. He is the first prime minister of a new nation of Kenya in 1963. But Kenyatta forgot a lot of these lessons. Under his new government, he put political opponents in jail. He outlaws rival political parties. Dissent was not allowed. This is something that Kenyatta originally fought against. Large, violent protests spring up around Kenyatta's regime during the mid-1990s. Kenyatta and the ruling party held off truly free elections until foreign investors forced the country to move towards greater democracy. This happens in 2002. This was just a long time of a totalitarian, nearly leader. 2002, the people of Kenya enjoy their first free election, and Kenyatta and his party are finally out of the government. Unfortunately, the new Kenyan government will remain corrupt, and ethnic conflicts will lead to thousands of deaths and many left homeless. So where Ghana succeeded, Kenya really struggled with decolonization. And that makes Nigeria even more difficult. After World War II, once again, the British government will kind of begrudgingly acknowledge the growing demand for independence in the colony of Nigeria. They will, right in the center, kind of central western part of the country. When Nigeria wins its independence in 1960, there was hope that it could develop very rapidly because they've got natural resources, things you need to develop an economy and modernize. They have cocoa, they have palm oil, and more importantly, they have crude oil, which was discovered on the Niger River in the 1960s. The problem is, during the age of imperialism, Nigeria, the borders will be created around a group of more than 250 different ethnic groups. Many of them want power or independence. The three largest groups are the Igbo people, or a couple of the largest groups, the Igbo people and the Yoruba people, who were Christians in southern Nigeria. And the third of the big three were the Hausa Fulani people, who were Muslims in the north. You can see it's ready for a civil war. Nigeria will adopt and write a constitution. And the problem is the constitution sought mainly to protect the different regional areas. All right, everyone looked for their own regional homeland than themselves as a greater part of a whole community. By 1966, the first military coup was led by a group of Hausa officers. When the Hausa take over Nigeria, 20,000 Igbos were massacred. This severely angered the Igbo people, who declared the creation of a new country called Biafra. They did this in 1967. This will create a civil war between the Hausa Fulani and the Igbo that will last about 3 years. When it ends, the tiny region of Biafra had its ports blockaded, and the people of southern Nigeria were being starved out, like a good old-fashioned medieval siege, and they have to surrender. Now comes the oil industry. Once again, Nigeria should have an easy way to bring in money from abroad. They have oil. They allow the government to set up many large, massive industrial projects in order to pay for these industries. The government can do it, but they need startup cash. So they borrow it from Western governments who say, you can pay us back with oil. The lure of jobs in the oil industry led to a massive migration from the rural villages to the urban areas. So by the late 1990s, the capital of Nigeria has about 6 million people. Things are looking good. But all of a sudden, oil prices collapse. And the government of Nigeria was insanely corrupt. They were taking money from the oil profits, socking it away in their own bank accounts, and not giving anything to the people. Nigeria had been run by military governments. Each one promises to end the corruption, give the people freedom, land, honest, good government, on and on and on. And in 1999, free elections are finally held. Democracy will return to Nigeria. Problem is, with the many different religions and ethnicities, God, what's wrong with me today? It makes it very difficult to fully unify Nigeria. The different ethnicities, there we go, again, keep an eye out for themselves and not their part as a massive whole country, community, kingdom. So today, unfortunately, there is renewed violence. And the sad thing is, Nigeria has plenty of resources to be industrialized, to be its own standing nation, but the political, religious, and ethnic divisions just don't allow it to happen. Still working on it, but there's where you can see the ills of decolonization. Which brings us to our next stop. That is right smack dab in the middle of the country, Zaire or the Congo. Congo has just been hammered since its existence. No territory has been more exploited than the Congo, starting with the decision at the Berlin Conference back again in the 1880s to give control of the Congo to the country of Belgium. Congo, like Nigeria, is very rich in resources. It's got a lot of copper and rubber, which is essential in the new industrial economy of the 1900s. It has a perfect location along the Congo River. Its many tributaries make it easy to get goods out of the interior up down to the coast and up into Europe. But after World War II, Belgium had once again been ravaged during the fighting. And as weak as they are, they want to hang on to this prized colony. But after watching other colonial conflicts happen throughout Africa, Belgium suddenly reverses its position and says, you know what, Congo, you're independent, go for it. They just kind of took their hands and went, we're out. And they turned around and just left the Congo. They did nothing to help them to prepare to become modern. Just like Nigeria, there's over 200 different ethnic groups in the Congo. It seemed that each one wanted its own political party, and the nation quickly falls into unrest. And then we get the guy you see right up there, all right? Patrice Lumumba becomes the first prime minister of the Congo in 1960. And he finds out very fast that he ruled over a deeply divided country. The southeastern part of the country was known as the Katanga province that had a lot of copper in it. One of the leaders from down there is a guy named Mosi Tshombe, this angry looking guy on the left. And Tshombe in 1960 says that the Katanga province and all of its copper is going to be independent. Tshombe gets the support of the Belgian mining owners who are like, great, Belgium's gone, we'll work with this guy and become rich. Hearing this, Patrice Lumumba, the prime minister, goes to the United Nations for help. But as he does so, the world had become embroiled in the Cold War. And when the UN drags its feet, Congo gets help from the Soviet Union. Ooh, man. Uh-oh. Can't trust those communists. During this turmoil, the Congo military leads a coup. And they take one of their own, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, and they put him into power. and Mobutu will become known as Mobutu Sese Seko. He takes over by capturing the Prime Minister Lumumba and hands him over to Tshombe in the south. Tshombe assumes the leadership role of the Congo. In 1965, though, Mobutu comes in and says, you know what, I'm taking over and I'm going to change the name of this country from Congo to Zaire. And I clearly remember when this happens. For the next 32 years, Mobutu will just pillage his own country. He used the army, the secret police, bribery, and he stole just literal billions of dollars from his countrymen who were starving. I believe when they kick him out, I remember, and this was a breaking news story, he had at least $32 billion in offshore accounts, and he just leaves. All right. Many of the people and were worked to death. The amount of resources in Zaire, the Congo, it could have been one of the wealthiest, most productive, and powerful nations in Africa. But Mobutu's leadership ran it into the ground. The people were some of the poorest in all of the developing world. Infrastructure collapses. The agricultural crops fail. The copper mines and precious gems are all closed down. But Mobutu stayed in power because he, unlike Lumumba and Tshombe, was anti-communist. While the Western countries didn't like him, they needed him to keep out the communists. In 1997, again I clearly remember this, Mobutu was finally ousted by Laurent Kabila. And the people of Zaire were looking for a change, but Kabila, while promising democracy and that he was going to return, everything back to normal, he bribes other political parties so he's able to remain in power. And within threat of another civil war in 2000, Zaire's rebels tried to overthrow his regime with one of their own, but it just doesn't quite work out. Political problems still haunt Zaire to this very day. Again, with its resources, the potential to be a powerful, massive country, to be a leader in Africa was there. Unfortunately, they were plagued with regional ethnic violence, and things just are still bad as we speak. This brings us almost to our final stop in Africa, close to it, and that is Rhodesia/Zimbabwe. The British colony of Rhodesia had this great location, excellent for farming, and for over 300 years, white settlers had come to southern Africa and created very big, lush farms necessary to grow cash crops like tea and cotton, but also citrus fruits. Rhodesia also has gold and copper and coal, and it, with its natural resources, is a rich, thriving nation. Problem is, the white settlers made up a tiny portion of the Rhodesian population. Their large farms will take up over half the landmass of the country. The rich property owners also controlled the government. Once again, after World War II, as independence and nationalism come to Africa, the white settlers were pressured to give up their land and share power with the black majority. Well, the predominantly white government rejected this idea, even when Great Britain supported the new majority. The whites of Rhodesia refused. And they were led by a prominent member of their government, a guy named Ian Smith. Rhodesia declares its independence in 1965. Now, the minority government began to encounter active resistance from Rhodesian guerrilla forces led by the guy on the left, Robert Mugabe, who said, no, we want access to government. And his resistance will last for over 15 years. Unfortunately, the violence created by Mugabe will spill over into other neighboring countries. It leads to massive poverty, economic disaster for the southern African region. But by 1979, Mugabe's forces control much of Rhodesia. Many of the rich white settlers fled Rhodesia, like the Romans going to Constantinople, or the businessmen and the educators of China fleeing to Hong Kong and Taiwan. They just left. When that happens, the United Nations comes in to impose sanctions. And these economic sanctions were due to the suffering and the violence, and it destroys the Rhodesian economy. Mugabe and Ian Smith will negotiate a treaty that would allow a new black majority government in Rhodesia. And so in 1980, Rhodesia renames itself Zimbabwe. Well, Mugabe named it Zimbabwe. And now they have to recreate their image. 15 years of civil war had badly hurt the country. They also needed to recover from the harsh UN economic sanctions. On top of all this, there were several years of massive drought. And when the whites left and they turned their farms over to their co-ops, a lot of the produce and the money was shared. Well, all those Africans left, so the field hands were doing the work again. Like my buddy Bob, they had no idea what to do. When drought sets in, the cash crops, the citrus crops dry up, and these factors combined with the struggle for power keeps Zimbabwe from growing in strength and power, even with all of their resources. Now in 1980, Mugabe becomes the elected president of Zimbabwe, but because of differences with the Shona people, who were the majority, and the minority people, the Nebels, is the best way I can say it, N-D-E-B-E-E-L, Nebel, party, they are the minority. Mugabe says, look, with you two guys fighting, it's much better just to have a one-party rule. It's much easier if I do it by myself. So he says he's going to unify the new nation of Zimbabwe. He's going to help it on its road. But as he does, once there is opposition, Mugabe will eliminate them. He will try to rebuild the industry and the agricultural potential that Zimbabwe once possessed, but all this was done at the price of political freedoms for the people. What Mugabe said, you did. Now he encourages some of the white plantation owners to stay and help their new country to reach its potential, but Mugabe's land redistribution techniques, very similar to Fidel Castro's, just simply don't work. Much more is given to the black majority, but they simply didn't have the knowledge to overcome the drought. They had torn up all the irrigation pipes to the citrus crops in the fields to sell on the black market, and now they had nothing. It was all destroyed in the Civil War. So by the late 1990s, Zimbabwe was again struggling. The tribal leaders of the black majority wanted all of the land taken back. It's still a big issue in Zimbabwe today. And again, like Nigeria, like the Congo, like Kenya, Zimbabwe has tremendous potential, but it's still trying to recover from the colonial rule and the guerrilla and civil war that ravaged the countries in the mid to late 1900s. Which brings us to South Africa. The country of South Africa is famous for the way things have gone there forever and a day. The country of South Africa has been controlled by colonial rulers for nearly 350 years, since the Cape Colony. It was by far and away the most racially divided country, where a small white majority controls the much larger black majority. By 1910, South Africa was able to gain self-rule from the British Empire. In 1931, it becomes part of the Commonwealth. And while South Africa has a constitution, the government heavily favored the white minority. This will usher in what we know as apartheid. In 1948, the Afrikaner National Party comes to power, and they institute the policy known as apartheid, which means separation of the races, white and black. Under apartheid, all South African citizens were required to register by their race. There's white, there's black, there's mixed ancestry, and Asian. The Afrikaner government said apartheid would allow each race to develop its own separate, distinct, and unique culture in the country. In reality, it was the simplest way for the white minority to dominate everything. The whole place was segregated, from schools to hospitals, neighborhoods you could live in, and the best premier areas always went to the white minority. In 1959, the South African government set up things called homelands for the country's black majority. They were akin to the Native American Indian reservations by Andrew Jackson. We're going to take the best stuff and give you the worst. The policy of creating the homelands unbalances the scales, all right? The black majority make up 75% of the population, but the homelands, they receive the smallest and least productive parts of the land. It was absolutely, by far and away, just terrible. This will allow for the beginning of the African National Congress, or the ANC. Now, the ANC goes all the way back to 1912. Black South Africans create the African National Congress as a way to fight for their rights. They began to organize strikes, they had protest marches, and their goal was to protest the racist policies of the government. In one of these protests, 69 men, women, and children were killed in the small black township of Sharpsville. It becomes known as the Sharpsville Massacre. And it pushed many people who were pursuing this nonviolent policy to get more radical, to get into an armed struggle. One of these guys is the famous guy on the right-hand side here, Nelson Mandela. Mandela was famous for being able to recruit young South Africans to peacefully resist apartheid laws. But after the Sharpsville Massacre, Mandela joins the militants. He's angry, he's just frustrated, and he's arrested in 1962, where he is sentenced to life in prison for treason. And while he was in prison, he becomes a major symbol for the world, symbol for freedom of the large black majority in South Africa. By the mid-1980s, the South African apartheid government falls under increasing pressure. A black South African bishop, then Cardinal Desmond Tutu, speaks out against apartheid. He's in the United States, and when he was done, the Olympic delegation revoked South Africa's invitation to the 1984 Olympic Games. Many nations agree with Bishop Tutu, and he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He encourages the international community to put economic sanctions on South Africa. Eventually it works, and Nelson Mandela is freed. Due to the efforts in bringing down apartheid, Nelson Mandela will also, for spending 28 years in prison, win the Nobel Peace Prize. So Tutu and Mandela both win it for South Africa. I think they would have rather given up that distinction had there been equality the whole time. But apartheid is about to collapse. In 1989, newly elected South African President F.W. de Klerk declares that his primary goal was to end the economic isolation of South Africa. By 1990, he allows the restoration of the African National Congress. Mandela is out of prison, and over the next couple years, most of the apartheid laws were repealed, and South Africa is once again about to be transformed. The biggest obstacle was how to form a new multiracial government with both blacks and whites in the government. Well, in April of 1984, the first open election of all races is held, and Nelson Mandela is running against President de Klerk, and Mandela wins. He is elected president of the truly democratic South Africa. And Mandela coins a phrase, "Let us build together." He doesn't harbor ill will. He doesn't fire all the white employees. He says, "Let's build together." He asks his old political foes to work with him to heal the country, saying that only together can the nation of South Africa succeed. And in 1996, South Africa passes a new, more democratic constitution. It has a Bill of Rights. It was modeled on the United States, and it guarantees equal rights for all citizens. Many South Africans looked for this success overnight. And while the country had many natural resources, there was a need in every possible area, all right, from education to housing, industrial development, vocational job training, farming. Not every problem could be handled at a time. So in 1999, Nelson Mandela steps down as president, but he stayed a very powerful political force in the government. And he stands out as an example as he worked with his guys who threw him in prison. However, the gap in common education remains very big between blacks and whites. Under Mandela's leadership, the country was able to build bridges between ethnic groups, helping South Africa move forward. The changes that take place in South Africa are an example for the rest of the continent. This is how you grow a democracy. This is how hope and a will to succeed, things are possible. It's not going to happen overnight. It's hard work, but it can be done. So today Africa still faces many problems, from changes and challenges. The independence movements from colonial rule will create new nations. But then there's the Civil War, the corrupt dictators, the fledgling economies that should work. There is the problems of the Cold War, anti-communist, anti-capitalist. Countries that did not like democracy and turned towards socialism were isolated by the Western governments. And Africans have a strong sense of loyalty to their own tribe or region, not a large national government or a new nation, making creation of Central African government really difficult. Another obstacle that they have to surmount was the rapid population growth. Smaller plots of land were depleted. People can't grow enough food. By the late 20th century, there was massive drought and famine. It killed off a lot of Africa's agriculture. It killed livestock. Diseases will be epidemic, from malaria to river blindness. Then there was AIDS. Modern day we have Ebola. There's not adequate drinking water. There's not adequate health care. And military guys like Idi Amin try to use their military might and power to curb these problems and restore civilian rule. But they often fall back instead as using it as a way to gain power and then not give it back. There is the regional genocide in Uganda and Rwanda, the continued drought in Somalia, where the Somalis have resorted to piracy, and there are many challenges that the decolonized African continent still faces. The United Nations and many industrial countries work and are working with African governments through things such as the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, trying to bring health care, education, peace to Africa. Many independent countries work with the UN on missions throughout Africa. Church groups do it. The main issues, however, that the UN are trying to combat are health care, education, and economic development. By opening up refugee camps to inoculation clinics to education, the UN has tried to restore peace. And according to the UN, their biggest obstacles continue to be racism, regional religious and ethnic genocide, and implementation and distribution of new technology. Along with that, wealth distribution across the continent. How do we bridge the new urban movement with African traditional customs? When Africans move from the villages to a city to look for work, they become urbanized. They forget their customs and traditions, how they grew up. These problems affect Africa. They also affect Japan and China, where city dwellers were criticized for being too Western in their dress and beliefs. While the UN continues to work in Africa to bring peace, stability, and education where it's needed, it's still a long, hard road to travel. So that is Africa. It is the biggest. We are going to do decolonization in Asia next, and then after that, Latin America. Asia is pretty short. We're going to lump Latin America in with Asia. It is a big one as well. All right, we'll see you guys.